What if Anakin and Ahsoka joined the rebels? What would happen then? Let's find out. So in this alternate timeline, Palpatine had a different plan for Anakin. Instead of making him his apprentice, Palpatine decided to capture Anakin and keep him in stasis until he could perform a Sith essence transfer to move his own soul into Anakin's body. This change in plan leads to Order 66 being executed slightly later than in the original timeline. Most Jedi are still killed, however Anakin and some others, including Ahsoka, are captured and taken to Mount Tantus. Anakin to be kept in stasis there, and the others for midichlorian experimentation. A year later, during Clone Force 99's attack on Mount Tantus, Anakin is awakened from stasis. And then, alongside a heavily experimented upon Ahsoka, Anakin escapes and seeks assistance from Bail Organa. During this time, Anakin learns that Padme died under mysterious circumstances on Naboo shortly after the Jedi Purge. Later, with Bail's help, Anakin meets Saw Gerrera and agrees to join his forces. So, this story is set roughly 5 years after Anakin and Ahsoka became part of Saw Gerrera's forces. In that time, Anakin and his former apprentice would have become integral members of Saw's resistance and would be leading the movement alongside Saw. So in this story, we pick up with Anakin on his way to a rebel base on Dantooine. He had been sent an urgent transmission directly from Saw Gerrera himself. It was one of those requests so secret that Saw demanded it be discussed in person and not over comms. And so Anakin got onto a ship as soon as he could and made his way to Dantooine, where Saw had arranged this meeting. As for Ahsoka, she had been unavailable for this mission, engaged with matters that couldn't wait. Because of that, it was just Anakin and a few of his most trusted accompanying him on this meeting. Their ship, a rugged freighter with the markings scratched and painted over more times than anyone could count, emerged from hyperspace over Dantooine. Anakin felt the familiar lurch as the ship slowed from light speed, and he moved from the comms room to the cockpit to take in the view of the planet below. The golden light of Dantooine's dayside glowed brightly beneath them, expansive fields and craggy hills stretching out into the distance. As they began their descent, Anakin adjusted his stance in the cockpit, his eyes narrowing as they moved toward the shadow of the night side. The ship angled downward, crossing the Terminator line, the divide between day and night, plunging them into the deep, muted blues of dusk. The 2 moons of Dantooine hung high above, bathing the planet's surface in an ethereal, silvery glow. Clouds rolled beneath them, their tops glowing faintly from the distant sun, and the ship shuddered lightly as they pierced through them. An encrypted transmission was sent to the base below, and in return, they received a set of coordinates, along with encrypted landing instructions. The base itself was hidden, the kind of location only known to those who absolutely needed to know. Anakin could sense the unease among his crew, though they spoke little. They were used to taking risks, but there was something about Saw's sudden urgency that put everyone on edge. Once they had broken through the clouds, the landscape of Dantooine's night side came into full view. Wide fields gave way to rocky terrain as they approached the landing coordinates. The ship's lights illuminated the ground as they descended, kicking up dust and pebbles until, finally, the landing struts made contact with solid earth. The ramp descended with a hiss, and Anakin walked down, flanked by his loyal crew. He was met at the base by one of Saw's resistance members, a young man with hollow cheeks and eyes that darted around, always wary. "Saw's inside," the man said without preamble. "He hasn't left his room since he received the transmission." Anakin's brow furrowed, and he exchanged a glance with one of his companions before turning his gaze back to the man. What exactly did he receive? The man shook his head. "I don't know, sir. You should ask Saw yourself. He's been on edge." Anakin nodded, gesturing for the rest to stay behind as he made his way further into the base. The corridors were dimly lit, narrow, the air thick with the scent of rust and oil. It was a place that looked as though it had been carved out of the earth, a crude, functional hiding spot for a group that was always on the run. Anakin moved with purpose until he found himself standing before the door to Saw's makeshift quarters. He paused for a moment, taking a deep breath before pressing the button to open the door. It slid open with a mechanical groan, revealing Saw hunched over a table in the center of the small room. The table appeared to be lit with holographic schematics, blueprints of something that Anakin couldn't immediately identify. He stepped inside, the door sliding shut behind him. "Saw," Anakin called out. Saw's head snapped up as soon as Anakin stepped into the room. "We have him, Skywalker." Saw's voice thundered through the small room, almost echoing off the metal walls. Anakin took a step forward and asked, "Who? What exactly do you mean, Saw?" Saw turned away, nearly stumbling over a pile of parts in his rush. He pointed towards a holodisplay set off to the side, the light flickering slightly. The excitement emanating from Saw was infectious, even though Anakin could feel the recklessness hidden just beneath it. An agent of ours embedded within the ISB sent this transmission 2 standard weeks ago, Skywalker, Saw said, pointing towards the flickering holo display. At this point, Anakin turned his attention away from Saw and onto the holo display. The flickering image seemed to reveal a set of encrypted coordinates and a series of dates and times. Saw paused, letting the tension build, and then said the following. Palpatine, the Emperor himself, will be making a journey to his home planet of Naboo in just under a month. Anakin focused intently on the information on the display, his concentration sharpening. Saw nodded, a flicker of excitement flashing in his eyes. He's grown comfortable, arrogant. For once, he's decided to leave his safe little chair on Coruscant. He almost spat the last word, the hatred palpable in his voice. Anakin folded his arms across his chest, taking in the information. He looked back at Saw. Why? Why now? What's he doing on Naboo? A political stunt, Saw said, rolling his eyes as if the very concept disgusted him. He stabbed a finger at the holo display. A meeting with the Queen. Something about a new agreement over the plasma deposits on Naboo. It's all pomp and circumstance, a show for the people. But it's also a chance, Anakin. Our first real shot at the Emperor himself. Anakin's heart pounded in his chest. This was a big deal, maybe the biggest. He looked back at Saw. And your mole? Are they reliable? Saw didn't hesitate. He saved us more times than I can count, provided intel that saved lives, allowed us to avoid entire Imperial fleets, and made key strikes possible. He knows what he's doing, Skywalker. He's solid. Anakin nodded, his eyes flicking back to the display, his mind racing. All right, what else did the report say? Saw moved back to the table he was standing in front of when Anakin arrived, and said the following, pointing towards the hologram on the table. This is the blueprint of the Theed Royal Palace, Skywalker. Palpatine will be staying there once he arrives. He wants to make it look like some glorious return to his roots. He'll be putting on a show for Naboo, a grand spectacle to remind them of their connection to the Empire. Anakin looked up sharply. Theed Palace? That's bold. Saw nodded, his expression deadly serious. Bold, but stupid. The arrogance of a man who thinks no one would dare touch him. And that arrogance is exactly what we're going to take advantage of. Anakin took a deep breath, considering the implications. This could be it. The end of the Emperor. A chance to cripple the Empire at its very heart. I'm certain you have a plan on how we're supposed to do this, Anakin said. Saw's grin returned. As of now, only the highest members of the ISB and perhaps Palpatine's closest staff know of this trip. The security hasn't been upgraded to accommodate the Emperor's presence as of yet. If we move quickly, if we move before they start reinforcing the palace, we can have the entire place rigged to blow before Palpatine even sets foot inside. End him the moment he walks through the door, along with all his loyalists. Anakin stared at Saw for a long moment, processing everything. His mind was already running through the logistics, the risks. There were so many moving parts, so many potential pitfalls. Why did you wait 2 weeks to tell me this? Anakin finally asked. Saw's eyes flickered, a brief shadow of hesitation crossing his face. He looked away, his voice lower now, almost defensive. I know you, Skywalker. I know how you get about civilian casualties. I didn't want you to object. We don't have time for moral debates, not with this. Anakin felt a jolt of anger flash through him, but he pushed it down. He knew Saw well enough to understand his reasoning, even if he didn't like it. All right, how far along are you? How much have you already set in motion? Saw's grin faded as he began manipulating the holographic blueprints on the table before him. With the flick of his wrist, Saw enlarged the image. The palace, in all its opulence, lay before them like a vulnerable beast, the schematics expanding to reveal the entire layout of the palace in a 3-dimensional holographic projection. Anakin's eyes scanned the structure, noting the sprawling halls, ornate chambers, and the network of corridors beneath the main palace floors. Saw's finger moved to point at various sections of the hologram. We've got charges embedded in these support pillars, here, here, and here, he said, his finger sweeping across the shimmering blue image of Theed Palace. We've got enough firepower in place to level the entire east wing of the palace. Anakin's jaw clenched. The thoroughness of the plan was impressive, if brutal. Saw was clearly intent on ensuring nothing was left to chance, the kind of recklessness that came from years of seeing too many comrades fall and too many plans go awry. How did you manage to plant charges in the palace? Anakin asked, his tone skeptical. Saw's eyes lit up, and a proud smile spread across his face. Synthskin, he said, almost reveling in the word. We've utilized synthskin to perfection. We removed several of the palace's lower-level personnel, the cooks, the janitors, Not killed, I promise you, he added quickly, noting Anakin's darkening gaze. And we've replaced them with our own people. It is these agents of ours who have been setting the charges. And when the time comes, it'll be our people, on the inside, carrying out the final steps. And the charges themselves? They're coated in a special alloy, a mix of cortosis and other metals, that makes them virtually undetectable in scans. No standard Imperial sensor will be able to pick them up. Even if they do a sweep, the charges are so well embedded in the existing infrastructure that nothing will seem out of the ordinary. Palpatine's forces won't see what's right in front of them. They won't know until it's too late. Anakin studied the hologram for a moment, his fingers tapping his chin thoughtfully. Meanwhile, Saw continued. EMP charges, he said. We've hidden them in the walls. When they go off, they'll fry every piece of electronics within a kilometer. Communications, alarms, any failsafes, gone. No calling for backup, no raising any alerts. He paused, then added, We've also sliced into their surveillance. Our slicers have control of every camera in and around Theed Palace. The moment Palpatine enters, we'll know. His guards won't be able to move a muscle without us knowing about it. And there's more. We've rigged the hangar. The moment the Emperor arrives, we can lock down his shuttle, make sure he can't escape. We've even got snipers in place, stationed in the hills surrounding Theed. If something goes wrong, if he somehow manages to survive the blast, they'll take the shot. Anakin took a deep breath, eyes still fixed on the holographic display of Theed Palace. Saw, he began, his tone deliberate. If we go through with this, we're risking the lives of innocent people. Saw turned, his demeanor stiffening as if he had been waiting for this. Palpatine surrounds himself with his own. His security, his loyalists, those will be the people inside that palace with him once he arrives. And the charges, they can be set off strategically, precisely when Palpatine and his entourage are in position. Very few innocent lives will be at risk. Anakin stared at Saw, his brow furrowing slightly, but he said nothing. He didn't agree, but he couldn't come up with an immediate argument to counter Saw's confidence. There were so many unknowns, so many variables, and yet here they were, on the brink of something monumental. Saw took Anakin's silence as acceptance, a confirmation that he was satisfied with the answer. Saw stepped closer, his intensity unwavering. I'll be on the planet when this goes down. We need everyone for this, Anakin. I want you and Ahsoka to join us, to be there in case things go south. We need all the power we can get, all hands on deck. This could be our one shot. Though the unease in his gut hadn't faded, Anakin tried to push it aside. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that they were heading into the unknown with not enough caution and too much reckless ambition. But the opportunity was too significant to ignore. Ending Palpatine here, now, could bring the Empire crumbling down, could save countless lives. It was worth the risk, wasn't it? Anakin could not be certain. The day had finally arrived, so Anakin, Ahsoka, and the rest of their small crew infiltrated Naboo. They were disguised as wealthy merchants, the kind of people that Naboo security forces knew better than to bother with routine protocols. Cloaked in opulence, they had seamlessly blended into the glamorous environment of Theed. They had made their trip to Naboo long before Palpatine's trip to Theed was known to anyone outside the ISB. Their base of operations was set up within an extravagant hotel building, booked under their false identities. Their suite, spacious and richly decorated, had become their headquarters for the mission. It provided an excellent vantage point, and more importantly, it kept them close to the action, while avoiding unwanted attention. There was also a good reason why they arrived on Naboo as early as they did. Arriving early meant they avoided the heavy security that would inevitably be put in place once Palpatine's arrival was announced. They didn't have to deal with the additional checkpoints, the pat-downs, or the scrutiny that the heightened Imperial presence would bring. Now all they had to do was wait and observe as their plan moved into its final stages. Anakin stood by one of the large windows of their suite, the silken curtains drawn just enough to allow him a view of Theed's majestic skyline. In the distance, he could see the Theed Palace, its golden domes shimmering in the early morning light. It was quiet for now. The city carried on its usual routines, unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. Everything was in place. Their agents, embedded within the palace staff, had reported that all charges had been successfully planted, every device rigged and hidden flawlessly. The snipers were in position, nestled in the surrounding hills, their scopes trained on key entry and exit points. The slicers had full control of the palace's surveillance systems. All that remained was for the Emperor to arrive. Anakin turned to Ahsoka, who sat cross-legged on the floor, her eyes closed as she focused on her breathing. Despite everything, she seemed to radiate a confidence that steadied Anakin's own nerves. The years of fighting alongside Saw's forces had changed them both. Their once bright and hopeful outlook had been replaced by a hardened resolve. And on this particular mission, both Ahsoka and Anakin were at a peculiar disadvantage. This disadvantage being them not being able to use the Force. Not now, at least not until Palpatine had been eliminated. This was because calling upon the Force could reveal them, especially to someone as powerful as Palpatine, and they could not risk alerting him to their presence here. If he sensed them, if he even had the slightest suspicion, he might decide to leave, and that would destroy what could very well be their only chance at ending the Emperor's reign. They couldn't afford that. Ahsoka then stood, stretching her arms above her head. "Any word from our people inside?" she asked, moving to stand beside Anakin, her eyes following his gaze to the palace. "Not yet," Anakin replied. "They're maintaining radio silence until it's absolutely necessary. We can't afford any transmissions being intercepted." He paused, glancing at her. "We just have to trust that they're ready." Ahsoka nodded. The room was filled with a tense silence, the kind that settled over you when you knew the world was about to change, one way or another. They waited, the minutes stretching into what felt like hours. Every so often, Saw would check in with their slicers, ensuring that all systems were still under their control, that no one had detected their tampering. Everything was running smoothly, but Anakin knew better than to let his guard down. Not until it was over. Finally, the silence was broken by the soft beep of an incoming transmission. Saw, who had been pacing near the comms unit, lunged for it, his eyes widening as he read the encrypted message. He turned to face Anakin and Ahsoka, a spark of excitement lighting up his face. "Palpatine's Star Destroyer has exited hyperspace over Naboo," Saw announced, his voice barely containing his fervor. Anakin exchanged a glance with Ahsoka, both of them feeling the weight of the moment. This was it. Everything they had worked for, everything they had sacrificed, had led them to this point. Anakin's heart pounded as he watched Palpatine's shuttle descend towards Theed. The shuttle touched down in the shadow of the Grand Palace, a flurry of activity around it as the crimson-cloaked royal guards emerged, forming a protective barrier as Palpatine himself descended the ramp. Through the sliced surveillance feeds and the media hollows, Anakin studied the man who had haunted his life. Palpatine looked different, older, frailer, almost diseased. His skin was pale and sallow, his movements deliberate and slow. "He looks like he's rotting," Ahsoka whispered. Anakin kept his gaze on the hollows, focused. The procession made its way into the palace. There were media personnel everywhere, holocams capturing every angle of the Emperor's arrival. Anakin paused, shifting his attention to Saw. "There are too many civilians. If we do this now, we risk killing dozens of innocent people," Anakin said. Saw gave him a sharp nod, his focus unwavering. "They'll be gone soon, and that's when we move. We can't afford to wait any longer than that." Anakin swallowed his unease and watched as Palpatine entered the grand hall of the Theed Palace, meeting with the Naboo Queen. The holocams provided many angles. He could see the tension in the Queen's posture, the forced smile on her face as she greeted the Emperor. Anakin leaned closer, peering into the hollows, trying to gather every detail. He couldn't reach out with the Force without risking their presence being detected, but his eyes showed him more than enough. Suddenly, the tension in the room broke with the sharp chime of one of Saw's comm devices, a secure line meant to be used only in dire emergencies. All heads turned, with Saw snatching up the comm and answering. "For the Empire," a cold voice said on the other end, and then the comm went dead. The surveillance feeds cut out, replaced by static. The room seemed to freeze, Saw frantically trying to re-establish connection, but there was no response. Ahsoka immediately moved towards Saw, her demeanor grim, trying to help. Anakin stayed rooted in place, his eyes darting between the comms unit and the now dead hollows. Something had gone terribly wrong. He glanced out the window toward the palace, then back to the flickering displays. A moment later, the hollows went completely black, and then a massive explosion, the shockwave rippling through the air, followed by another, and then another. Theed Palace was under attack, explosions tearing through its ornate structure. Anakin could only watch in horror as multiple charges went off, one after the other, until the entire palace crumbled in on itself, a cloud of dust and debris rising into the air. Anakin's mind raced, possibilities flashing through his thoughts. Had Palpatine's own people betrayed him? Was this an inside job? He couldn't make sense of it. And then, finally, he did the one thing he had avoided since arriving on Naboo. He opened himself up to the Force. The dark side was thick, oppressive, the echoes of death and destruction overwhelming. But there was something else, a wrongness, a deception. "That wasn't Palpatine," he yelled, the realization hitting him like a blow. He shifted his focus to Saw, who looked bewildered, lost. "What do you mean?" Saw asked. "We've been played," Anakin said, his tone sharp. "We're exposed. We need to leave, now." Saw's mouth opened, as if to argue, but the words caught in his throat. He took in the urgency and fear on Anakin's face. "What happened?" he finally managed to say. "We weren't the only ones with spies," Anakin replied. Ahsoka's head snapped up. She had sensed, in that moment, the armed forces coming for them, and the look on Anakin's face confirmed to Ahsoka that Anakin had also sensed this. "For being surrounded, we need to leave, Saw," Ahsoka said. Saw seemed to understand, finally, his expression hardening. He addressed his crew. "Everyone to the hangar. Alert any of ours, still reachable," Saw finished. They tried, but the signals were jammed. Anakin addressed the group, his tone carrying authority and urgency. "We'll get out of this together," he said firmly. The suite they had turned into their base was devoid of any weapons, owing to the strict no-weapons policy enforced in the building. The only weapon they had was the Force, and Anakin and Ahsoka knew how to wield it. They would have to rely on that strength to get them out of this mess. Anakin moved swiftly to the corner of the room where their computer systems were set up. He keyed in a sequence, entering the self-destruct codes to erase all their data. The others watched anxiously as the lights on the computers blinked out, one by one, the hum of machinery dying down. Anakin faced them, his expression firm. "It's done. Let's move." With Ahsoka taking the lead, the group exited the room, entering the hallway outside. They kept a brisk pace, Anakin and Ahsoka at the front, with Saw and the Resistance members close behind. The two Force users could feel the presence of the troopers approaching, though, curiously, not as many as they had anticipated. They hurried down the hallway, reaching the end where a split presented itself, stairs on one side and an elevator on the other. Without hesitation, Anakin gestured towards the stairs. "Stairs? We can't risk getting trapped in an elevator," he said. The others nodded, and they moved quickly, their footsteps echoing off the walls as they approached the stairwell. Just as they were nearing the stairs, a chime echoed through the hallway. Anakin's head snapped around as the elevator doors opposite them slid open. A squad of stormtroopers stood inside, their blasters already aimed and ready. The lead trooper's voice cut through the silence. "Halt!" he ordered. But then, the stormtroopers were caught off guard as Anakin and Ahsoka's hands moved in unison, the Force yanking the blasters from their grips before they could fire a single shot. The weapons flew across the room, and Saw's Resistance members quickly snatched them from the air. Without hesitation, the rebels opened fire, the bright bolts of energy lighting up the narrow hallway. The bolts struck down most of the troopers in a matter of seconds, leaving only 3 standing. Anakin's voice rang out at that point, sharp and commanding. "Stop," he ordered. With a wave of his hand, the blaster bolts froze mid-air. Anakin then stepped forward, focusing on the 3 stormtroopers who still stood, their hands empty, trembling with fear. The troopers tried to fight back, lunging at Anakin in a desperate attempt to overpower him, but he was ready. A flick of his wrist sent 2 of the troopers flying backward, slamming them against the wall with enough force to render them unconscious. Only one remained, the captain, his rank insignia gleaming in the dim light. Anakin approached the captain, reaching out with the Force, his presence overwhelming the captain's mind. "Tell your commanders you have the rebels in custody," Anakin ordered. The captain raised his wristcom and transmitted the message, repeating the words without hesitation. But as Anakin looked down, he noticed something. A small cam affixed to the trooper's chest plate. His heart sank. Everything that had just transpired had been broadcasted, most likely to Imperial Command. Anakin's face darkened with fury. He extended his hand, and the captain was lifted from the ground, his body slamming into the wall behind him, crumpling into unconsciousness. He turned to Ahsoka, his jaw clenched. "The Empire was watching," he said. Ahsoka faced him, her resolve clear. "Capture is not an option," she replied firmly. Anakin gave a curt nod, and they moved, their pace quickening as they made their way to the stairs. Just before they left, Anakin destroyed the cam on the captain's chest plate, then discreetly reached for the captain's comm. As they descended, the comm crackled to life, providing them with updates, though nothing they didn't already know. The Empire was on alert, and they were expected to be headed for the hangar. Undeterred, Anakin and Ahsoka led the group down the stairwell, their senses heightened, drawing fully on the Force now. The narrow hall seemed to fold away before them as they moved, their path almost preordained by the current of the Force guiding their actions. Every obstacle in their way, locked doors, security droids, was obliterated with ease, either pushed aside by the Force or taken out by the blasters. And so they made their way towards the hangar, prepared for anything. Stormtrooper TK-4993 knelt in position, his E-11 blaster rifle aimed at the large hangar doors. His orders were clear: destroy anyone who emerged from the hangar, no exceptions. His helmet comm buzzed with updates, informing him that the rebels were making their way towards them. He wondered how they had made it this far without being captured. Rumors of Jedi involvement had spread among the ranks, and it frightened TK-4993. more than he cared to admit. Jedi were thought to be all dead. The idea that one might be here now, against him and his squad, was terrifying. Still, he took some comfort in the presence of his fellow troopers. They had been on missions together before, and survived, and there was a bond there. A bond that reassured him that they could make it through this mission as well. He kept his aim steady, the hangar door looming before him, the tension building in the air. The comm buzzed once more. The voice of his commander came through his helmet, calm and confident. The rebels are on the other side of the door. Prepare yourselves. TK-4993 tightened his grip on his blaster. Exhaling slowly, he pictured himself back on Coruscant, in the entertainment district, sharing a drink with his comrades, telling stories of the battles they had fought. This would just be another story, he told himself. A story that would soon be over. His thoughts were abruptly shattered by a groaning sound, the sound of metal straining against an unimaginable force. His eyes widened as the hangar door began to bend, the thick durasteel crumpling as if it were mere tin. The noise grew louder, the door twisting until it was ripped free from its frame, hurtling through the air. TK-4993 dove to the side, barely avoiding being crushed as the door slammed into the ground. He rolled to his feet, raising his blaster and firing towards the opening, only to see something he had never witnessed before. The blaster bolts, his own and those from his fellow troopers, hung suspended in the air, frozen just before reaching their targets. It was as if an invisible barrier surrounded the rebels, a bubble of protection that nothing could penetrate. TK-4993 watched as the group of rebels advanced towards a shuttle parked at the far end of the hangar. Those who attempted to get close were thrown back by unseen forces, their weapons yanked from their hands by an invisible grip. The rebels moved with an eerie calm, untouched and unbothered by the chaos around them. TK-4993 kept firing, but his shots were meaningless, each one halted by the same impenetrable shield. He could only watch as the rebels reached the shuttle, boarding it without a single casualty. The moment they were inside, the shuttle's engines roared to life, and it lifted off, soaring out of the hangar. The suspended blaster bolts, no longer held in place, shot off in their original direction, hitting nothing of consequence. TK-4993 lowered his blaster, a mix of awe and disbelief washing over him. The Jedi, if that was what they were capable of things he had never imagined. But as he watched the shuttle disappear into the sky, he found himself oddly relieved. He had survived, and he now had an incredible story to tell whenever someone asked about his job. Inside the shuttle, Anakin stood in the cockpit, his eyes scanning the skies as the pilot expertly maneuvered the craft out of the hangar. He and Ahsoka stood ready, their senses heightened, prepared to deflect any attacks that might come their way. The shuttle, though outwardly appearing as a simple luxury vessel, was anything but ordinary. Saw had spared no expense for this mission. The ship was equipped with a cloaking mechanism, a tool that could be the difference between life and death. Anakin asked the AI if there were any tracking devices on the craft. Confirmed, the ship's AI replied. However, modifications have been made to disable any such tracking. The tracker is currently non-functional and poses no threat. Anakin gave a nod, satisfied. As they cleared the hangar, the cloaking mechanism was engaged, and the shuttle vanished from all Imperial scanners. Moments later, they entered hyperspace, leaving Naboo behind. Saw sat in the main cabin, a mix of confusion and frustration on his face. He looked at Anakin, his brow furrowed. What just happened back there? Anakin took a seat across from him, staring into the swirling blue of hyperspace. The Empire was onto us, he said. They infiltrated your people. The ISB mole was compromised, probably for a long time. The Palpatine we saw, it was most likely a decoy. Saw's eyes widened, darkening with realization. They wanted to discredit us, Anakin said. The palace's destruction will be blamed on us, and no one, not even our allies, will believe we weren't responsible. The rebellion will fracture, support will dwindle, and Palpatine, he'll appear as a frail old man who barely survived an assassination attempt. He'll gain sympathy, and the Empire will use this to justify increasing military funding and tightening its grip. Saw leaned back, the weight of it all sinking in. Anakin continued, his tone grim. Also, I believe they let us escape. What do you mean, Skywalker? Saw asked in a defeated tone. Think about it, Anakin said. The Imperial forces were light. They could have easily overwhelmed us if they wanted to, but they didn't. It was all planned. They put a tracker on our ship, probably hoping to catch us later, away from Naboo, out of the public eye. They let us escape so it would still fit their narrative, giving them the excuse to justify increased militarization while capturing us quietly. Ahsoka, standing beside Anakin, nodded. The Empire must have suspected Jedi involvement. Now, with the footage, they've got exactly what they need. Us using the Force. That's all the proof Palpatine needs to push the narrative that the Jedi are still out there, working to destroy the Empire. Anakin clenched his fists. This further justifies increasing military funding, tightening security measures, and cracking down even harder on any planets showing the slightest sign of dissent. Saul frowned, then said, "But I suppose this proves the Empire did not know who you two actually were. Palpatine would have done anything to capture or eliminate you both. He wouldn't risk letting Anakin Skywalker and Ahsoka Tano slip through his grasp." "Maybe, but I doubt our disguises on the footage will keep us hidden for long. Once Palpatine figures out it was us, he'll use our identities to fuel his propaganda." Anakin finished,